The Colorado Authors League presents The Cal Zone, the League's official podcast. Welcome to a place for tasty conversation about books, art, and more, all created by members of the Colorado Authors League. Here's your host, Tricia Copeland.
Today we have Todd Mitchell. He is a CSU professor as well as director of creative writing at Colorado State University. So CSU, Colorado State.
Actually, I'm not director of creative writing. I'm director of the Beginning Creative Writing Teaching Program.
Oh, okay.
So I work with graduate students who teach creative writing classes. I have to make that distinction because at this time of year, I keep getting all these emails from students who are applying to the graduate program. And,
you don't need more emails than you already have.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
I am not the person you are looking for.
Exactly.
So tell us about your author career so far, and I'm interested in learning about the switch from fantasy writing to nonfiction writing.
Oh, right on. Well, so I actually did a fiction program at CSU where I now teach. And I graduated from there almost 25 years ago. So it's been a long time. And at that point, I was writing mostly adult literary fiction. And I'd published a few short stories. But by the time I graduated from the program, I was pretty burnt out on a lot of on writing, on adult literature. So I asked myself, like, what were the books that first made me fall in love with writing and with stories? And I'm dyslexic, so I came to reading pretty late. I wasn't really reading in third and fourth grade. It wasn't until a teacher started reading books aloud to the whole class, like reading novels aloud, that I really got what reading was about, because that was the first time I was able to discuss books with my peers. And those books had a profound impact on me. So after I graduated from the MFA program, I went back and I read some of those books that helped me fall in love with writing. And they were books like A Wrinkle in Time and Tuck Everlasting. And then I started wondering, well, what's getting published now for these same age groups? And I didn't know it at the time because it was around just like early 2000s, but I was just starting to explore middle grade and young adult literature at a time when that was exploding in the publishing industry. And so I had written several novels beforehand that just never really came together, but I decided to try writing a book that maybe my 10-year-old self would have loved. And that became my first novel that I think clicked. And that was picked up by Scholastic. Actually, I have it here. It's called The Traitor King. And this cover I love because this is done by, I think, one of the best cover artists in the business, a guy named Tim O'Brien, who's done he's painted more covers for Time magazine than any other living artist. You've certainly seen his work, including a lot with our current president on it. And he also did the covers for like Hunger Games and all of that.
Oh, wow. That's exciting. That's very cool.
Yeah, I didn't know it at the time. I was very lucky with all the people I worked with on this book. David Levitham was the editor, and he's also an amazing writer. And he's kind of a legendary editor in the young adult field at Scholastic. But several of his books, have been made into movies. So it was nice to work with an editor who understood writing. And from that point, I sort of bounced back and forth between writing young adult books like The Secret to Lying and then writing more fantasy, or actually this one's really sci-fi, speculative fiction, like The Last Panther. This one came out with Penguin Random House, and then more YA books, and then more fantasy for middle grade. So I've been all over the place genre-wise, but it was about 9 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I pretty much drove myself to a breakdown, and I think it was the luckiest thing I've ever done in my life because it led to some of the best changes in my life. And at that point, I was finding it very hard to go on with writing at all. And so I had to explore what this whole creative thing was about. And I started researching creativity and different creative practices. I'd already been researching such stuff a bit beforehand in my role as a director of a beginning creative writing teaching program, really looking at how do we help bring out creativity in others. But at that point, I needed to ask some pretty profound questions of myself and why I wanted to create things. And that's the things I learned from that research and from the changes I started to explore so profoundly affected me that I wanted to share them. And that's what led to me writing Breakthrough, which is how to overcome doubt, fear, and resistance to be your ultimate creative self. And it was mostly I just wanted to share the things that I found so useful for me in not just creating a better creative life for myself or a better relationship with creativity in my life, but a better life overall, because I think life is fundamentally creative.
How did you experience writing like fiction versus writing nonfiction, and how did you go about that and structuring the book? How was that different for you?
As you rightly noted, this was a book of a necessity for me. It was the book I needed. And I've always thought like the best writing advice, which I think I originally heard from John Gardner, was write the book you most want to exist. And I think if you make that your guiding star, you're not going to go wrong, because if you want it to exist, chances are other people want to read it too. And if it already exists, we'll go out and read it and then ask yourself again, okay, now what's the book that I really want to exist in the world? And so this was the book that I definitely needed. As far as the process, though, of making that switch between fiction and nonfiction, I had a bit of experience already writing nonfiction and creative nonfiction. I'd written some for different magazines. I had also I'd been teaching creative nonfiction, and I had published several creative nonfiction essays, but I had never attempted to do a whole book length thing. And for me, anytime I embark on a book, it takes many years. So it has to be an idea that keeps knocking on the door and won't leave me alone. And so it was when I not only had the sense of like, this book really needs to exist, but I have too many chapters to like do as separate essays. I know I started to start thinking like, okay, what's the larger arc? How do I arrange it? I think narrative is a jealous God. So when we're writing fiction, even if we have an idea of what we think we want the story to be, we kind of, at one point or another, we're going to be humbled. And the story is going to say, no, this is what the story is really about. And you have to put that first. Otherwise, the reader is going to like feel the hand of the author coming in and manipulating things. So with fiction, a lot of it is about setting my own thoughts aside and really asking the story, all right, and asking the characters, who are you? What is this that wants to be? What am I getting wrong? And really exploring that way. With a nonfiction book like this, which I really think of as, I'm not against the term self-help, but I think personal development is more accurate, because self-help kind of implies like, oh, help, I'm drowning, like, it implies need versus the ongoing process of constantly trying to develop, which I think is something that we all engage in. So you don't need to be in crisis to read personal development books. It's just, can you enhance your relationship with creativity? Yeah, well, then why not take the steps to do so? But the difference for me is with nonfiction, it's really about like constantly asking yourself, of all these things that I know about this, whether it's things I've learned through research, things I've experienced, all this that I feel is important to share, what is it that the reader absolutely needs to know? So it's really that constant dialogue, or just imagining the reader and thinking about not what goes in, but what gets cut out. And trying to pare it down to the minimum so that you're not wasting the reader's time, but you're giving them just the essence of what is needed, because there is so much in life that we could write about that's real. But then the question is, well, what's going to be necessary to that reader right now?
Interesting. Yeah. So did you also incorporate like personal stories in the book in the breakthrough?
I
Like
did.
personal examples or
Absolutely, because we need stories. We learn and think in stories, and also yeah. So there are parts where the book, I think, becomes more memoir or creative nonfiction, um, and that was really challenging for me. And I don't like to talk about myself. I'm someone who much prefers to listen rather than talk. Um, so it was hard for me to put myself on the page, and it gave me a great deal of respect for uh, authors of memoir who share really difficult, intimate stuff, which is what I tried to do in this book. Um, to give like really the essence of my own experience and that and it was a very difficult experience. So, it was hard to share some of the things that I shared.
I can
Um,
imagine. But yeah, I feel like that storytelling piece is where whatever, and I tend to go into stories, I think because I'm an author. My husband, his eyes will roll literally when I start something. I'm like, okay, stop telling a story. People don't always care to hear the whole story, right? But I mean, I feel like when I hear a story, something will stick with me more than if somebody just gives me a few facts and the end point, right? Or
yeah,
like I'm learning more because of the story and I'm going to remember it better because of the story. And having that personal touch point of knowing that someone has gone through this and it's benefited them or learned from that, it feels like it would be a bonus in that
yeah.
self-development. Thank you for using that term because I was grasping for that term.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like narrative shapes the way that we think and act. So, if somebody's like, well, can you just, boil it down to bullet points? I'm like, you can. Um, but that's probably not going to shape the way that you think and act as profoundly as if you understand the story.
Right. So another term so I have never taken creative writing. I've taken writing classes. I will tell you that. But my background is science. I came from a technical writing background, research background. So didn't like study this in college. I
Hmm.
never thought that I would be an author. I did not see myself as a creative person at all. So it was interesting that you talked about that creativity piece and everybody being a creative. But
Hmm.
what is creative nonfiction? Define that for me.
Yeah, so creative nonfiction is sometimes called CNF. It's really an umbrella term um, for a lot of different subgenres of nonfiction writing, from things like literary journalism, which is if you've read Tom Wolfe's book, I've from the right stuff to electric Kool-Aid acid tests, he really he originally was trained as a journalist, but then he's like, I feel like we're not getting the essence of the story, so he wanted to go much deeper and started to develop this whole subgenre of literary journalism. Memoir is part of CNF. Lyric essays, that have started to mix um, more poetic elements or sonic elements, and explore different forms. Um, and then hermit crab essays, which inhabit other forms. Like all of this is CNF, including creative science writing, um, which one of my colleagues at CSU, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, Jerry Callahan, one of the only geniuses I've like somebody who I would just not hesitate to call a genius, who I've met in my life. He was a professor of pathology, but he also had an appointment in the English department. He published several collections of creative science writing, which I highly recommend. One is called Faith, Madness, and Spontaneous Human Combustion. And these essays, which incorporate a lot of scientific research and different points, they also tell stories. And again, you've noticed that power of stories to change the ways that we think and act. And these stories are ones that haunt me that I've never forgotten.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I met a girl one time and she was an author. She was a new author, indie author like me, and we just met at an event and she said she was getting her PhD in scientific writing and I thought, what? Like there is a PhD in scientific writing and she's like, yeah. And now she works out here. Like I met her on the East Coast and she works out here. So it's really interesting. Like I was blown away by that because I feel like, and maybe I had a narrow view of, and maybe more things are offered now than when I was in school too. Like I just never heard of anything like that. So
Mm-hmm.
that's interesting that you're putting more like, so it's nonfiction content, but you're making it more enticing or interesting with other literary elements, basically, is what.
Exactly, exactly. And yeah, creative nonfiction is kind of it's a hard term to define because even if you just think of that title, creative nonfiction, like it's a term that's trying to define itself by what it is not. Um,
Okay.
but I think you're hitting on the key point. Thing it's writing that engages the real, whether it is, whether it's history or science or somebody's real experiences, um, travel experiences, whatever it is. But it's using the elements of fiction, such as, there's characters, there's dialogue, there's scene description, all these things that make a novel come alive. We're trying to apply those tools to either make our own experiences come alive or somebody else's experiences come alive. And I think people recognize this when they look at like the huge publishing realm of creative nonfiction. When we think about books like whether it's John Krakauer's Into Thin Air, as being a book that combines his own experiences, his own memoir experiences with journalism and literary journalism to tell a story that brings to life some real experiences. Whether it's more traditional memoirs, whether it's true crime writing, um, another, oh, Henrietta Lacks, that's one that I would say was like creative science writing. I'm forgetting the full title, but huge bestseller. Um, Written by a CSU alum.
Well, we don't want you to give away too much that is in your book because I think a lot of authors might be interested in getting breakthrough. But can you give us just maybe a couple of hints that maybe authors can use if they feel stuck or if they're stuck creatively or just having trouble with their craft?
Having a creative practice is extremely important. It's one of the most powerful ways I know to constantly develop personally, to expand your own consciousness. I really approach a creative practice as almost a meditative practice. And I think one of the things I discovered as I started to research super creators, like people who have been highly creative throughout their whole lives, is that they approach creativity for intrinsic rather than extrinsic reasons. So when we want to enhance our relationship with a creative practice, what we really need to do is look at, first off, what's getting in the way? What is making, what is the source of our doubts, our fears, our resistance, our procrastination, and try and address those root causes. And what I discovered when I researched that, and when I'm talking about research, I looked at the neuroscience of creativity, the psychology of creativity. I interviewed several creators. I was able to, for instance, get some images and comics from some of creators that I admire most, including cartoonist Linda Berry, who's like author. What is she? She's a MacArthur Genius Award-winning cartoonist who has written one of the best essays I've ever seen on creativity, a graphic essay on creativity called Two Questions, and she generously allowed me to excerpt some pieces of that to talk about it. So creating for those intrinsic rather than extrinsic rewards is one way to make creativity much more sustainable and really aligning yourself with what those intrinsic rewards are. What happened to me is something that I've seen happen to a lot of not just writers, but other creators I've known, is we get a damaging notion of what creativity is from a lot of the toxic success myths that surround us. So, for instance, when I first started off as a writer, I told myself, okay, well, I need to publish my first book by the time I'm 24, or I'm just not cut out to do this. And why 24? It was because that was when some of the authors I admired had published their first book. So right away, I started out playing the comparison game, constantly comparing myself to others. And that in itself is so destructive to creativity. But for a while, I was able to push myself onwards by using this comparison game. I thought it was a good way to motivate myself. And I didn't realize how it not only was making me unhappy, it was eroding my ability to access creativity, to really find like what are the stories that only I can tell. And so this is the book that I kind of wish I had had 30 years ago when I first started to develop some of my creative habits and creative practices, because I think I would have saved myself. There's the cat.
There's the
Hello.
This is Smokey.
Hello, Smokey. Yeah, because I think I would have saved myself a lot of suffering, as well as like maybe been able to have more creative breakthroughs if I had established more healthy, sustainable creative habits from the beginning. But sometimes we have to, see out why something doesn't work first. And that's certainly I've seen a lot of other creators do, is they drive themselves into a ground until they have a breakthrough. And then maybe that breakthrough will reveal something that will be useful to them, that will serve. But I don't think, I don't believe in the suffering artist myth that we have to suffer for creativity. So I kind of try and find the joyful artist and the more blissful ways to approach creativity. That's much more sustainable.
Yeah, I was going to say I am most happiest when I'm writing, so I want that to always be the case.
Yeah, and research backs this up, actually. I think we've often heard the advice that we're most creative when we're at play, but research has shown that actually we are measurably more creative when we are happy. When we are enjoying what we do, and when we're happy. What shuts down creativity is fear. And that really narrows our perspective. And I see a lot of creators motivate themselves by putting on pressure, saying, I have to do this or else. And that evokes a lot of fear. That starts shutting down their creativity. Then they get into like a frustrating spiral, feel like they're, slamming their head against the wall and become increasingly desperate. So it's not just in this book, actually. I work with a lot of other creators now on helping people enhance their relationship with creativity. And if you're curious about that, my website for that is creativepersonaldevelopment.com. And that explains a little more what this work is like.
Yeah, I noticed on your website you did have a lot of blog posts and articles to help writers, like in the writing craft, but as well as like mental blocks and things that maybe you talk a little bit about, or probably all of the things you talk about in Breakthrough.
Yeah, and I mean, there are a lot of books that, for instance, talk about how we can optimize our productivity. And I do touch on some of those tips and techniques, whether it's the Pomodoro technique, or ways to deal with procrastination, how to, practice creative gratitude to make creativity more rewarding so you can develop a creative habit, even using behavioral training on yourself. So for instance, after doing a Pomodoro, rewarding yourself with like a couple jelly beans or something, not that you need it then, but what you're trying to do is trick your brain to say like, oh, I really enjoy doing this because that makes it easier to show up at the page next time. All that stuff is really useful. And there's a lot of those like very pragmatic tips in the book. But what I'm also very interested in is what are the root causes of our doubt? What are the root causes of our fear and our procrastination? And how do we address that? And that's where the truly life-changing stuff comes in.
And do you have any workbook style in your book? Do you have like questions that people can like start and ask themselves and then maybe journal a little bit in the book, or would that be outside the book?
No, I mean, the word workbook is one that gives me chills. Like,
Sorry.
who wants a workbook? Like I need more work.
Wow.
But yes, there are, it's not workbook style, but there are a lot of like, try this or I'm very interested in making the theoretical practical. So I have a lot of like want to take things a step further, a lot of ways to integrate these different practices into your daily life, including some practices that, for instance, an existential therapist gave me that I think are again just very useful for living a more joyful, blissful life, as well as enhancing your relationship with creativity.
Sorry to drop the workbook. I will say prompts. How about that? Prompts to get
So
me thinking about my fears in order to list them, because I feel like you probably have to list them and know what they really are before you can overcome them, right?
that is a really good activity to do, and something when I do creativity workshops, I often have people do is to take a moment and think about what it is that stands in the way of their creativity. Um, and just trying to get curious about it and trying to name it, whether like what are our specific doubts. You know, for me, um, the deep fear that I had is if I wasn't more successful as a writer, I wouldn't get to keep writing. Um, and it wasn't until I actually wrote that down and shared it with my wife and took a step back that I realized, like, oh, well, I was writing long before I was successful as a writer, and this wasn't a barrier then. Um, so, yeah, when you examine it, you can kind of diffuse some of these blocks. But you can also look at, well, where is that really coming from? And again, how do I address that root cause? You know, when you write the book that you most want to exist, the audience that you're first and foremost trying to please is yourself. Um, you know, and I think if you can please yourself, you're going to please others. And that's what I mean by creating for more intrinsic rather than extrinsic reasons. And I think those extrinsic things are important. Like, yes, writers need to make money. You know, we want readers, but we're more successful at reaching those goals when we're driven from a more internal place that isn't dependent on like the fickle rewards of life outside, like whether somebody else likes it or not. Like the creators I admire who are like, I don't care. I am making what I'm called to make. And those are the artists who have, you know, truly changed the course of our society in the past, who've had that sort of bravery and courage. Um, so there's this old Japanese adage about perseverance that I like that fall down 7 times, get up 8. And for many years, I prided myself on being the grittiest of the gritty. And as I like fell down or was knocked down, I was like, well, you can't stop me. I'm going to like clench my fists and grit my teeth, and I'm going to get up again and again and again. And because of that, it took me a long time to get to my breakdown. And I'm so glad I got there, because of what I learned afterwards. And one way of looking at it is Sure, you can force yourself to clench your fists and try harder. That's one way to persevere. That's not the best way to persevere. Like the secret to fall down 7 times and get up 8 is to learn to appreciate falling and learn to appreciate getting up. So you're operating from this much stronger internal place of like, I am doing this because I find this just rewarding to do. Um, and then you're no longer trying, you're more aligned with life, your being. That opens you up much more to creativity, and to um, enacting your visions for others to see.
That's a really beautiful thought and vision, because I think, as writers, a lot of people say, well, write what you know. But I think, it's writing what you also are passionate about, because I think readers are going to see that too, or feel that too in your writing. Like if you're writing something about your passion, whatever story it is, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, whatever you're writing, if you're really passionate about it and you're really passionate about your craft and getting those ideas or values or whatever you're putting on the page to a reader, then I think readers are going to sense that and be more attracted to that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, that old Robert Frost quote, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader, no tears for the writer, no tears for the reader. It is true of joy and passion and interest too. So yes, if you find that thing that excites you and are able then to center your art around that, I think you're going to find it attracts others.
I think that's very true. Well, and it's interesting. And I can go back a little bit to what you were talking about, training yourself, or because I was like, oh, this is just like training my puppy. You give
Mhm.
myself a reward for writing for 15 minutes. That, writing something that I enjoy writing for 15 minutes, and then I get an extra soda or an extra cup of
Yeah.
coffee now, right?
And this is where like toxic success myths lead us astray, and get us to keep playing the comparison game so that we're constantly judging ourselves. So a lot of times like people will, maybe write for half an hour and then look at what they wrote and be like, oh, damn, it's crap, and then they feel really bad. It's not where I want it to be. It's not good enough. And we think that's the way to motivate ourselves because it's the way we're often encouraged to motivate ourselves, whether it was that gym teacher who was like, as I think back on my life and growing up in the 80s and 90s, who was like swearing at us and calling us names to try and make us go harder. Or wherever that voice comes from, we really got to question that, because if you do the opposite, if instead you like spend that half an hour writing and then take a moment to practice creative gratitude and say, wow, half an hour ago there was nothing, now there's something here, isn't that amazing? Look at like the discoveries I've made with this. If we make that our habit, then what happens is you are more connected with what makes creativity enjoyable, which makes it far, far easier to return to creativity the next time.
Interesting. Yeah, that gratitude piece is exactly where my brain went, because I started a gratitude practice last year.
Hmm.
And so now, if there's negative things happening, I'm like, okay, well, that's happening, but what are we grateful for now? And
Hmm.
I do the same. I have just started doing the same thing with positivity. Like
Hmm.
and maybe they're the same thing or limited, but instead of focusing on maybe all the things that are wrong, I'm going to focus more on the things that are right. And, if there is something that I can control about changing XYZ, then I can change it. If there's not something I can control about XYZ, then I just let it go and move on. So I
Yes,
think, you can apply these same practices. It's interesting to creativity and your work. Um, and yeah, and
absolutely.
I grew up in the 80s too, so I totally get that. This is what you did wrong.
Yeah.
I got a negative 120 on a paper one time in English. I will never forget that, because she
So
counted
much red ink.
no, she counted 20 points off for any run-on sentences or sentence fragments or something, and I got the lowest grade in the whole class.
Oh, wow.
It was,
Just
yeah, it was very humbling. And maybe
beating
that's
the
the
style
reason
right out
I
of
did
us.
it. But
Yeah.
she ended up being my favorite English teacher. So she was a good teacher, but I think she was making a point in the beginning.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
One thing that you said a moment ago, like, okay, so gratitude, we often hear the advice of like, okay, keep a gratitude journal. Um, and I think we might be like, yeah, I've heard that. That's whatever. Like, does that really work? It actually does. And we have the research that shows that it does, and it can make a significant difference. But this, I see, gratitude is different from positivity, which I'm kind of I think there's a lot of toxic positivity as well. And so I'm much more for holism. I once asked a therapist, like, do you believe in the power of positive thinking? And he responded, yes. And I also believe in the power of negative thinking. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. Like we leave out that half. And with wholeness or like holistic thinking, you don't want to leave out anything. You want to look at it all. We're not trying to like ignore the bad, but the magic question, the one that I think is really useful just to always keep in your back pocket when those hard things happen, and to make a habit of constantly applying is how does this serve? So when something that, we perceive as bad happening, like a failure, and I write a lot in this book about failure because one key to becoming more creative is to become comfortable with failure. And I give a lot of both research and compelling examples of why this is so important. But highly creative people are people who do not fear failure. And failure is actually not something to fear. So all failures are perceived failures. It's when we want things to go one way, whether it's like, I want my book to sell 100,000 copies and any less is a failure. And instead, something else happened that we look at as lesser. And that feels like a failure. But the beauty of failure is it's really our ego's kryptonite. And so failure is very, very important for growth. And because your ego becomes very rigid and limiting. It is one way to think of the ego is it is actually a set of limiting beliefs that we carry around and identify with. And so things that like challenge our ego might feel hard when they're happening, but are very important to our growth. And so if we ask ourselves the question, when we experience something that we perceive as a failure, like how does this serve? Take like that, 30 minutes of writing. And then afterwards, you're like, I didn't get the scene done that I wanted, or I don't like what I wrote, or it doesn't seem very good. And so it feels like a failure. Like I intended to do this, something else happened. But then if we ask ourselves that question, how does it serve? We might see, oh, the reason why this doesn't work is actually very instructive. It tells me that there's something I haven't unearthed about this character that I still need to learn. And that's kind of exciting. I have something to learn here. I have something to discover. And then you might switch, from telling to asking the character, okay, what am I missing about you? Why didn't this work? Why wasn't the scene very good? What's the scene that you want to be in? If we start interacting with our creative compulsions that way, opening ourselves up more to what wants to be than what we would think we need to create, we're going to have a lot more creative discoveries. So constantly, all throughout life, how does this serve? We don't have to love it. We don't have to like gaslight ourselves into thinking that bad things are good, but we can create the habit of starting to see how useful some of these challenging experiences are.
Yeah, that's very telling. I think that's really powerful of saying, okay, yeah, because if sometimes I'm writing and I'm like, oh, I'm kind of bored or I'm not really feeling it. And I always have to go back and say, okay, why? Like if I'm getting bored
Yeah.
with what I'm writing, the reader is going to be getting bored and they're not going to be having fun or entertained or any of those things. So I always have to go back and say, okay, what's going on with this character? What's going on? How can
And
I
that
amp this
boredom is
up
so
more?
important. Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, neurological research into creativity has shown that boredom is often the predecessor to a breakthrough. So when we get bored, we can also be a little excited, like, oh, what am I missing? Same thing with failure. We learn far more from failure or perceived failures than we do from success. So we can start developing the habit of like seeing what we learned from failure to the point where when we have a perceived failure, we're like also have this excitement of, what am I about to learn? I thought things were going to go one way, they went another. What am I about to learn? And when we do that, it eases the sting of failure, makes us less afraid, makes it easier to engage the creative process, makes us more open to what creativity has to show us.
These are such wonderful insights. And I was trying to kind of as we talked, take a couple of like big pieces. And one of them was that doing things from an intrinsic motivation and having that be a guide. What would you say were the other two main points, maybe from what we've talked about?
I think as much as possible, you want to develop healthy, sustainable creative habits. I mean, it's never too late, but like do that early on. And early means now. Like, it's like, okay, yeah, best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. Second best time is now. Like, how do I establish these healthy creative habits now? And there are a lot of them that can really, even in small ways, start making a significant difference throughout your life. Something else, though, that we didn't get into that I do discuss in Breakthrough and that I think is good for writers to keep in mind is when we're doing this work of bringing something new into existence, we are opening ourselves up to what is beyond ourselves. Like the definition of creativity is bringing something new and it's the process, it's the act of bringing something new and somehow useful into existence. And for it to be new, it also has to be new to you, the author, which means you don't know what you're going to create until you've created it. You might think you know, but oftentimes that thinking you know what you're going to create is limiting your creativity. So a lot of the process of enhancing our relationship with creativity is getting out of the way. It's showing up, it's doing the work, but also getting out of the way of what we think it has to be and discovering what it is or what it could be or what it wants to be. Also for fiction writers, we're often engaged in the process of putting our characters on a transformative journey. And I think it's important to recognize that as writers, we don't just transform our characters. We transform ourselves through this creative process. So as we get better at understanding how we transform our characters, like, the different steps of that transformative journey, we might also get better at navigating difficult transformations in our own life. Mm-hmm. This is one of the reasons why I think like a creative practice, especially like writing, can really enhance our lives. And if we're not approaching writing in a way where it's like, yay, I look forward to writing and I see how writing is helping me enjoy my life more, makes me a better human, makes me more aware, makes me more connected, then we might want to take a close look at how we're approaching writing.
You've been listening to the Cal Zone, the official podcast of the Colorado Authors League, supporting and promoting its creative community since 1931. Learn more about us at coloradoauthors.org. This is a production of the nonprofit Colorado Authors League.